He did not begin as a king, a president, or even a famous man. George Washington began as a quiet boy with strong character, a steady hand, and a courage that would one day help create a nation. George Washington was born in a plain, old-fashioned house in Westmoreland Country, Virginia, on the 22nd day of February, 1732. He was sent to what was called an old field school. The country schoolhouses in Virginia at that time were built in fields too much worn out to grow anything. Little George Washington went to a school taught by a man named Hobby. In that day, the land in Virginia was left to the oldest son, after the custom in England, for Virginia was an English colony. As George's elder brother Lawrence was to have the land and be the great gentleman of the family, he had been sent to England for his education. When he got back, with many a strange story of England to tell, George became very proud of him, and Lawrence was equally pleased with his manly little brother. When Lawrence went away as a captain in the regiment raised in America for service in the English army against the Spaniards in the West Indies, George began to think much of a soldier's life and to drill the boys in Hobby's school. There were marches and parades and bloodless battles fought among the tufts of broom straw in the old field, and in these, young George was captain. This play captain soon came to be a tall boy. He could run swiftly, and he was a powerful wrestler. The stories of the long jumps he made are almost beyond belief. It was also said that he could throw farther than anybody else. The people of that day went everywhere on horseback, and George was not afraid to get astride of the wildest horse or an unbroken colt. These things proved that he was a strongly built and fearless boy. But a better thing is told of him. He was so just that his schoolmates used to bring their quarrels for him to settle. When Washington was 11 years old, his father died, but this mother took pains to bring him up with manly ideas. He was now sent to school to a Mr. Williams, from whom he learned reading, writing, and arithmetic. To these were added a little bookkeeping and surveying. George took great pains with all he did. His copybooks have been kept, and they show that his handwriting was very neat. He also wrote out over 100 rules for behavior in company. You see that he wished to be a gentleman in every way. His brother Lawrence wished George to learn to be a seaman, and George himself liked the notion of going to sea, but his mother was unwilling to part with him, so he stayed at school until he was 16 years old. A great deal of the northern part of Virginia at this time belonged to Lord Fairfax, an eccentric nobleman whose estates included many whole counties. George Washington must have studied his books of surveying very carefully, for he was only a large boy when he was employed to go over beyond the Blue Ridge Mountains and survey some of the wild lands of Lord Fairfax. So when he was just 16 years old, young Washington accepted the offer of Lord Fairfax and set out for the wilderness. He crossed rough mountains and rode his horse through swollen streams. The settlers' beds were only masses of straw with perhaps a ragged blanket, but George slept most of the time out under the sky by a campfire, with a little hay, straw, or fodder for a bed. Sometimes men and women and children slept around these fires, as cats and dogs, as Washington wrote, and happy is he who gets nearest the fire. Once the straw on which the young surveyor was asleep blazed up, and he might have been consumed if one of the parties had not waked him in time. Washington must have been a pretty good surveyor, for he received large pay for his work, earning from $7 to $21 a day at a time when things were much cheaper than they are now. The food of people in the woods was the flesh of wild turkey and other game. Every man was his own cook, toasting his meat on a forked stick and eating it off a chip instead of a plate. Washington led this rough life for 3 years. It was a good school for a soldier. Here, too, he made his first acquaintance with the Indians. He saw a party of them dance to the music of a drum made by stretching deerskin very tight over the top of a pot half full of water. They also had a rattle, made by putting shot into a gourd. They took pains to tie a piece of a horse's tail to the gourd so as to see the horsehair switch to and fro when the gourd was shaken. When Washington was but 19 years old, the governor of Virginia made him a major of militia. He took lessons in military drill from an old soldier and practiced sword exercises under the instruction of a Dutchman named Van Brom. The people in Virginia and the other colonies were looking forward to a war with the French, who in that day had colonies in Canada and Louisiana. They claimed the country west of the Allegheny Mountains. The English colonists had spread over most of the country east of the mountains, and they were beginning to cross the Alleghenies. But the French built forts on the west side of the mountains and stirred up the Indians to prevent the English settlers from coming over into the rich valley of the Ohio River. The governor of Virginia resolved to send an officer to warn the French that they were on English ground. Who was so fit to go on this hard and dangerous errand as the brave young Major Washington, who knew both the woods and the ways of the Indians? So Washington set out with a few hardy frontiersmen. When at length, after crossing swollen streams and rough mountains, he got over to the Ohio River, where all was wilderness, he called the Indians together and had a big talk with them at a place called Logtown. He got a chief called the Half-King and some other Indians to go with him to the French fort. The French officers had no notion of giving up their fort to the English. They liked this brave and gentlemanly young Major Washington and entertained him well. But they tried to get the Half-King and his Indians to leave Washington and did what they could to keep him from getting safe home again. With a great deal of trouble, he got his Indians away from the French fort at last and started back. Part of the way they traveled in canoes, jumping out into the icy water now and then to life the canoes over shallow places. When Washington came to the place where he was to leave the Indians and recross the mountains, his pack horses were found to be so weak that they were unfit for their work. So Major Washington gave up his saddle horse to carry the baggage. Then he strapped a pack on his back, shouldered his gun, and with a man named Gist, set out ahead of the rest of the party. Washington and Gist had a rascally Indian for guide. When Washington was tired, this fellow wished to carry his gun for him, but the young major thought the gun safer in his own hands. At length, as evening came on, the Indian turned suddenly, leveled his gun, and fired on Washington and Gist in the dark, but without hitting either of them. They seized him before he could reload his gun. Gist wanted to kill him, but Washington thought it better to let him go. Afraid of being attacked, they now traveled night and day till they got to the Allegheny River. This was full of floating ice, and they tried to cross it on a raft. Washington was pushing the raft with a pole when the ice caught the pole in such a way as to fling him into the river. He caught hold of the raft and got out again. He and Gist spent the cold night on an island in the river and got ashore in the morning by walking on the ice. They now stopped at the house of an Indian trader. Nearby was a squaw chief who was offended that she had not been asked to the council Washington had held with the Indians at Logtown. To make friends, he paid her a visit and presented her with a blanket such as the Indians wear on their shoulders. Washington bought a horse here and soon got back to the settlements, where the story of the adventures of the young Major Washington was told from one plantation to another, producing much excitement. Regiment, a body of soldiers consisting of a number of companies commanded by a colonel. Eccentric, odd, peculiar in life or manners. Survey, to run the lines between different pieces of land and find out the quantity of land in each tract. Pack horses, horses used for carrying baggage. Raft, several logs, timbers, or boards fastened so as to float together in the water. Indian trader, a white man who sells goods to Indians and buys the skins of animals from them. When Washington got back from the western side of the mountains, it became evident to the governor of Virginia that the French must be either driven away or the English people must be shut in to the country on the east of the mountains. The people in the colonies did not like the notion of being fenced in like a lot of cattle in a pasture. So Washington was again sent to the West in 1754 to take possession of the country. On his first trip, he had seen the point where the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers meet, which he thought would be a good place for a fort. A small company of men were sent ahead to build a fort at this place, but the French drove them away and planted a fort of their own on the ground. This was called Fort Duquesne. Though the French in America were not many, they were nearly all soldiers. So when Washington, with his party, had got through the wild mountains into the western wilderness, he found that there were many more soldiers on the French side than he had. Hearing that a French party was dogging his steps, he marched in the night and surrounded them. After a sharp skirmish, the French fled, but were nearly all captured. This little fight was George Washington's first battle. But Washington soon found that he must retreat or be taken. He fell back to a place called Great Meadows, where he built a sort of fort and called it Fort Necessity. Here, the half-king, in despair, left him, and the French attacked his little force. After the conflict had lasted one day, Washington, seeing himself outnumbered, agreed to march out of the fort and return to the settlements, which he did. This expedition of Washington's was the beginning of a great war between England and France.
The next year, troops were sent from England under General Braddock, who set out to drive the French from Fort Duquesne. Braddock was a brave man, but one of the sorts who cannot learn anything. He laughed at the lank and careless-looking American troops who cut a sorry figure alongside of the English with their bright red coats and fine drill. He was sure that these rough Americans were of no use. Even American officers were treated with contempt by the British authorities and were not allowed to rank with English officers. Washington was so stung by this that he resigned his place, but he accepted a position on Braddock's staff. Rough as the mountain roads were, Braddock traveled in a coach as far as he could and tried to keep up the display common in Europe. He said that the Indians would not prove formidable when they came to fight his well-drilled English troops. Washington could not persuade the general to send scouts on either side of his line. One day, there came to Braddock a company of woodsmen in hunting shirts. They were commanded by the famous Captain Jack, who was known as the Black Hunter of Pennsylvania. Captain Jack's whole family had been killed by the savages in his absence. He had then taken to the woods and devoted himself to revenging the death of his family and to protecting the settlers. He and his followers lived in the forest and kept the Indians in constant fear of them. This Captain Jack and all his men came to General Braddock and offered to help him as scouts. But Braddock put all his confidence in his solid ranks of English soldiers, and he foolishly refused the offer of the Black Hunter and his men. As the army drew near to Fort Duquesne, Washington suggested to the commander that the Virginia Rangers should be sent in front because they were used to the woods. But Braddock was angry to think that a young American should advise an old British general. On the 9th of July, 1755, as Braddock's army was marching along the narrow track through the woods, the Indians and French attacked them. All at once, the woods rang with the wild war cry of the Indians, like the barking of 1,000 wild animals. The forest, but a minute before so silent, was alive with screaming savages. From every tree and thicket, the Indians leveled their rifles at the red coats of the English, who fell like pigeons under their fire. Unable to see anybody to shoot at, the English soldiers did not know what to do. The Americans took to the trees and stumps and returned the fire in Indian fashion, and Washington begged the general to order the British to do the same. But Braddock made them stand up in line, where they could easily be shot down. Braddock fought bravely and fell at length mortally wounded. Colonel Washington did his best to rally the men and save the battle. He had 2 horses shot under him, and 4 bullets went through his coat. The army, so gay and brave in the morning, was soon broken to pieces, and the men fled back to the settlements. But Washington had become the hero of the people. He was now put in chief command of the Virginia troops in defense of the frontier, and managed affairs well.
In 1758, he commanded the foremost division in an expedition under General Forbes, which slowly cut its way through the rough wilderness of Pennsylvania and, having at last got over the mountains, forced the French to leave Fort Duquesne. The fort was rebuilt by the English and renamed Fort Pitt in honor of William Pitt, the great Prime Minister of England, who was a true friend to the Americans. When a town grew around Fort Pitt, it was called Pittsburgh. The war between the English and the French was finally closed in 1763. Canada, with all the country east of the Mississippi, was given up to the English, and settlers soon began to make their way into the region now known as Kentucky and Tennessee. Before the war closed, Washington retired to his home at Mount Vernon and was married to Mrs. Martha Custis, a widow. Scouts. Soldiers sent out singly or in small parties to search for hidden enemies and to gain information. Woodsman, a man skilled in the ways of living and traveling in the woods. Hunting shirt, a loose shirt or jacket, at first made of deerskin, but sometimes of homespun cloth and worn by hunters. Ranks, rows or lines of soldiers. Rangers, troops employed to range or ride through the woods and guard the settlements from Indians. Wounded, injured as by a cut or a gunshot. Mortally wounded, so badly wounded as to cause death after a while. Washington lived for many years quietly at Mount Vernon, and he did not intend to have anything more to do with a soldier's life. He was fond of hunting and fishing. He sometimes helped to haul a seine in the Potomac River. He rode over his large plantation to see that all went well, and he made maps of all his fields and kept his accounts carefully and neatly, as he had always done. All traveling strangers were sure of welcome at his house, and the poor, when in danger of suffering, were provided with corn from his granary.
But as time went on, the English Parliament tried to collect a tax from the Americans. The Americans declared that so long as they elected no members of Parliament, that body had no right to tax them without the consent. But the men who governed in England did not think that people in the colonies had the same rights as people in England, so they oppressed the Americans in many ways. Without asking consent of the colonies, they put a tax on all the tea that came into America, and when some of the tea got to Boston, the people turned Boston Harbor into one big teapot by pitching the whole shipload of tea into the water. The English government resolved to punish Boston, but the other colonies took sides with the people of that town. In order to make the English government cease their oppressions, the Americans agreed not to wear clothes made of English cloth, nor to use anything else brought from England. Washington and other great gentlemen of that time put on homespun American clothes, which were coarse, for the Americans had not yet learned how to make fine goods. American ladies, who were extremely fond of tea, which they drank from pretty little cups brought from China, now gave up their favorite drink. Instead of it, they sipped a tea made from the leaves of the sage plants in their gardens, or from the roots and flowers of the sassafras. Probably they tried to drink these homegrown teas with cheerful faces and to make believe that they liked sage and sassafras as well as the real tea from China. It must have been a pleasure to feel that they were fighting a battle for liberty over their tea tables. Washington, in his quiet way, was a strong supporter of liberty against the King of England and the Parliament. In order to bring all the 13 colonies to stand by one another against England, a meeting, called a Congress, was appointed in 1774, and men were sent from each colony to attend it. Washington was a member of this Congress, which sent a letter to the king, demanding that they should be allowed the same liberties as his subjects in England. But neither the King of England nor the English Parliament would repeal the laws which the Americans disliked. As the Americans would not obey them, the quarrel grew hotter, and English troops were sent to bring the Americans to submit. On the 19th of April, 1775, the Revolutionary War was begun by a battle at Lexington, near Boston, between British troops and American farmers. These farmers, who were called Minutemen, drove the troops back into Boston, firing on them from every field and fence as they retreated. Seeing that war had begun, Congress looked about for a leader. They remembered the prudent and brave conduct of Colonel George Washington when a young man in the French and Indian War. He was chosen to be general and commander-in-chief of all the armies of the colonies. Before Washington reached the army near Boston, the Battle of Bunker Hill had taken place. In this battle, the Americans had been driven from the hill, but their little force of plain countrymen had fought so stubbornly against the well-trained English troops that all America was encouraged. For many months, Washington kept a fine British army shut up in Boston. When he was strong enough, he suddenly sent a body of troops to Dorchester Heights near Boston, where, by the help of bales of hay, breastworks were built in a single night. When the English general saw these works, he said, "The rebels have done more in one night than my army would have done in 1 month." The Americans began to throw shells from the Dorchester battery into Boston, which soon became so uncomfortable a place to stay in that the English army got into ships and sailed away. The Americans at first were fighting only to get their rights as subjects of England, but since neither the king nor the Parliament of England would let them have their rights, they got tired of calling themselves Englishmen. They determined to set up an independent government. On the 4th of July, 1776, Congress declared the colonies free and independent. This is called the Declaration of Independence. Soon after the declaration was adopted, the English government sent a fleet and an army to take New York. Washington fought against the English army on Long Island and was defeated and forced to give up New York. After a while, he had to fall back across New Jersey. It seemed as though all were lost, but though his men were too few to fight the whole English army, Washington felt that he must strike a blow at some part of it in order to give the Americans courage. The English people did not like the war against the Americans, so the king had hired some Hessian soldiers to fight for him. About 1,000 of these were in Trenton, NJ, while Washington was on the other side of the Delaware, a little way off. On Christmas night, the Hessians were celebrating the day. Washington celebrated it in his own fashion. He took part of his army and crossed the Delaware in the midst of floating ice. There was a severe snowstorm, and 2 of his men were frozen to death. He marched quickly to Trenton, and after a sharp fight, he took about 1,000 prisoners as Christmas presents for his country. Washington got back across the Delaware with his prisoners, but in a few days he was again in Trenton, where he came near being surrounded and captured by the English general Cornwallis. The Delaware was so full of ice that the Americans could not get back to the other side of it, and a strong English force was pressing upon them in front. Something must be done quickly. So at night, Washington had all his campfires built up in order to deceive the enemy. He put a few men to digging in the trenches and had them make as much noise as possible. Then he took his army silently by a back road around the English army till he got behind it. While Cornwallis thought he had Washington cooped up in Trenton, the Americans were marching on Princeton, where there was a detachment of the English troops. Washington, after a sharp battle, defeated the English in Princeton. Cornwallis had gone to bed boasting that he would bag the fox in the morning, but when morning came, the fox was gone. Cornwallis thought at first that the Americans had retreated across the Delaware, but soon he heard the booming of cannons away behind him at Princeton. Then he knew that Washington had outwitted him. He had to hasten back to New Brunswick to save his stores, while Washington went into the hills at Morristown, having forced the British to give up the greater part of New Jersey. Seine is a long net for catching fish, which is dragged through the water by men pulling at each end of it. Granary, a building for storing grain. Parliament, the body of men which makes the laws of England, consisting of the House of Lords and the House of Commons. Breastworks, ridges of earth thrown up to protect an army in battle. Fleet, a number of ships of war under the command of one officer. Outwitted, defeated by greater ingenuity or cunning. The Revolutionary War lasted about 7 years in all, a great victory which Washington gained when the war had lasted more than 6 years really finished the struggle. General Cornwallis, the same whom Washington had fooled when he slipped out of Trenton, had won several victories over American troops in the southern states, but he could not subdue the people, who were always ready to rise up again when he thought he had conquered them. Cornwallis marched northward from Carolina into Virginia, where he did a great deal of damage. Washington was in the north watching New York, which was occupied by English troops. He thought if he could capture the fine army which Cornwallis commanded in Virginia, he might end the war. So, making every sign that he was going to attack New York, in order that soldiers might not be sent from New York to Cornwallis, he marched at the head of the American and French armies toward the south. On the way, he visited his home at Mount Vernon for the first time in 6 years. Soon, Cornwallis and his army were shut up in Yorktown, as Washington had once been shut up in Trenton by Cornwallis. But Cornwallis was not allowed to escape, as Washington did. Troops were sent all around him like a net to keep him from getting away, while the French ships in Chesapeake Bay kept him from getting any help by way of the sea. The fighting about Yorktown was very severe, and the most splendid courage was shown by both the American and the French soldiers in charging the redoubts. The English fought with the greatest stubbornness on their side. During the assaults, Washington stood where he could see the bravery of the troops. One of his aides told him that it was a dangerous place for him to be in. "If you think so, you are at liberty to step back," said Washington. Presently, a musket ball struck a cannon near him and rolled at his feet. General Knox grasped Washington's arm and said, "My dear General, we cannot spare you yet." "It is a spent ball. No harm is done," answered Washington. Finding he could no longer resist, Cornwallis surrendered, and the war was virtually closed by the taking of Yorktown. The people of England had never liked this oppressive war, and the next year the English government felt obliged to acknowledge the independence of the United States. Washington did not seek to make himself a king or a ruler over the country he had set free. When his work was over, he gladly gave up command of the army and went back to become, as he said, a private citizen on the banks of the Potomac. While all the world was praising him, he went to work again taking care of his lands and crops at Mount Vernon, with the intention of never leaving his home for public life again. But the people soon found that their government was not strong enough. Each state was almost a little country by itself, and the nation Washington and others had fought so hard to set free seemed about to fall into 13 pieces. So a convention was called to meet in Philadelphia in 1787, 5 years after the close of the Revolution. This convention, of which Washington was the president, made a new constitution which should bind all the states together into one country under the rule of a president and Congress. When the new constitution had been adopted, it became necessary to choose a president. Everybody wanted Washington to leave his fields and be the first president. He was elected by almost all the votes cast.
At that time, the capital of the country was New York. There were no railroads or telegraphs, so a messenger had to be sent from New York to Mount Vernon to tell General Washington that he had been chosen the first president of the United States. As the general traveled to New York, the people turned out everywhere to do him honor. They rode by his carriage, and they welcomed him with public dinners in the towns. When he got to Trenton, out of which he had marched to escape from Cornwallis and fight the Battle of Princeton, he found the bridge over which he had marched that night beautifully decorated. A triumphal arch had been erected by the women of Trenton, and as the president passed beneath it, girls dressed in white sang a song of victory and strewed flowers before him.
When he reached Elizabethtown Point, there was in waiting for him a handsome large barge. In this, he was rowed by 13 master pilots dressed in white, and 6 other barges kept him company. The whole city of New York welcomed him with every possible honor. On the 30th of April, 1789, he took the oath of office in the presence of a great throng of people. Washington was again elected president in 1792. He refused to be elected a third time, and after publishing a farewell address to the country, he left the presidency in 1797. He died at Mount Vernon in 1799. From the worn school fields of Virginia to the frozen rivers of New Jersey, from lonely wilderness camps to the surrender at Yorktown, George Washington's life was a long lesson in courage, patience, and duty. He never sought power for himself, yet power followed him because he placed his country above all else. When war was won, he laid down his sword. When a nation needed unity, he gave it a constitution. And when he could have ruled longer, he chose to step away. Washington proved that true greatness does not come from titles or triumphs alone, but from character, steady in danger, humble in victory, and faithful to liberty. Because of his leadership, a struggling group of colonies became a united nation, and because of his example, freedom gained a guardian who asked for nothing in return. If this dive into the past lit a spark, don't let it fade. Hit like, subscribe, and drop your thoughts below. Who should we follow next? An explorer? A rebel? A mind ahead of its time? History isn't just dates and dust. It's a trail of daring choices, hidden struggles, and overlooked moments that quietly shaped the world around us. And we're just getting started.